We did it! We have finally caught up on all of the published classes for Pathfinder 2e. Classic Introductions is officially up to date. What's that? The remaster drops this month? Paizo! Today, I'd like to talk about the Gunslinger class for Pathfinder 2nd Edition on today's episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I'm the local disaster tour guide. That's right, I am a storyteller with the singular expertise in making bad puns. They should probably fire me for this joke. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder, and welcome back to the Classic Introduction series, where we take a look at what different classes in TTRPGs have to offer at the gaming table. We have been working our way through all of the classes in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and the only published class that I haven't covered yet in this series is the Gunslinger from Guns and Gears. So today we're going to be diving into the Gunslinger and examining what it has to offer players and what you can expect if you decide to try one of these at your gaming table. Now, in the Classic Introduction series, we take a look at each class through the lens of 7 specific questions. Number 1, what is the class role of the Gunslinger? Number 2, how complex is the Gunslinger, both to build and to play? Number 3, what are the key terms and concepts you need to be aware of if you choose to play a Gunslinger? Number 4, what are the strengths of the Gunslinger? Number 5, what are the weaknesses of the Gunslinger? Number 6, what build options or subclasses does the Gunslinger offer? And finally, number 7, what can you do to get the most out of the Gunslinger in play? In this video, we're going to dive into those 7 questions and take a look at some of the broad things you should be aware of if you're considering playing a Gunslinger. Now, that being said, we're not going to examine every single individual choice available to the Gunslinger, and you'll understand why when we talk about gear, but we will be examining some of the broad considerations and major points that come with playing this class. By the way, if you're interested in playing a Gunslinger, the main book that you're going to want to have access to is Guns and Gears. The Gunslinger can be found starting on page 104 of that book, with an additional class archetype called the Spellshot that is printed on page 140 of Guns and Gears as well. And while this probably isn't much of a surprise, most of the gear that you want to consider for a Gunslinger can be found in the book Guns and Gears as well. However, that is not the only product that has options for the Gunslinger. The Lost Omen setting book, The Impossible Lands, details the city-state of Alkenstar and the dwarven sky citadel of Dungenhold, and offers an additional Gunslinger subclass or way called the Triggerbrand, which we will discuss in the appropriate section of this video. The Triggerbrand can be found on page 107 of that book. And finally, I'd like to mention that the book Treasure Vault has a lot of things that a Gunslinger might be interested in well. In particular, it's worth checking out the alchemical ammunition that is included in that book, because that offers a lot of fun options for the Gunslinger player. However, all this material can be found online for free at Archives of Nethys, and I will have a link to the Gunslinger class in Archives of Nethys down in the video description, in case you want to go there and read up on this class just a little bit more. Now, before we dive into the Gunslinger, I would like to go ahead and do the YouTube stuff. The Classic Introduction series are some of the most complex videos that I make for this channel. They require a lot of reading and research and planning, and there's just a lot of work that goes into making the Classic Introduction videos possible. So when I throw out that YouTube appeal, please know that your encouragement really does mean a lot to this channel. If you can like the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, that truly means a lot. And you can become more involved with the Disaster Tour Guide community by checking out my free Discord or my Patreon. Those are linked in the video description. And one of the best things you can do to feed the algorithm is to jump down to the comments section, leave your thoughts and observations. But more than just feeding the algorithm, when I get to talk to you, that is the best part of this job. So I really do love hearing from you, and it does help encourage me to make more content like this. And I do ultimately have 16 remastered classes that I'm going to have to review in this series again at some point. But with all that out of the way, let's get started. Okay, so question number 1 for this series is, what is the class role of the Gunslinger? When I look at the Gunslinger in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, what can I expect and how does it play compared to other classes? Well, the Gunslinger is classified as a martial class, meaning that it's a combat-oriented class. There is no spellcasting with the Gunslinger. In fact, even the Spellshot class archetype that we'll talk about later doesn't come with spells built into that archetype. You can get them through other means, but the base Gunslinger in every variation is just a combat-oriented class. You have a gun or possibly a crossbow, and you're all about dealing damage with that weapon. As should be fairly obvious from the weapons that you're wielding, the Gunslinger is a martial class that is going to focus more on ranged combat. There are a few options for the Gunslinger that can mix some melee combat into the kit, but at their heart, the Gunslinger is always going to focus on ranged combat in one way or another, with a few other fun bonuses kind of scattered around that core identity. The Gunslinger is a class that is very much focused on offense over defense, and we'll dive into that a little bit when we get into some of the class abilities. But past their incredible offensive capabilities, the Gunslinger can pick up an array of other options, with the ability to do things like serve as the party scout or possibly even the party face. This is a class that has a strong core identity, but that has plenty of room to flesh out what it can do with some of the selections that you make over the course of your character's career. So with all of that being said, the Gunslinger seems like it should be a pretty straightforward and simple class. So let's talk about complexity, where I start complaining about all of the gear stuff you need to know with this class. Seriously, Paizo, what have you done to me? So when I talk about complexity rating, I do like to split it up into 2 different categories: how complex it is to build a class and how complex it is to play a class. And the Gunslinger is one of those classes that I think is reasonably easy to approach, but becomes a little more complicated when you actually try to play it. I give the Gunslinger a build complexity rating of 6 out of 10, and I give them a play complexity rating of 8 out of 10. Now, I will say that there are some simpler options with the Gunslinger where that play complexity rating can be toned down a bit. But regardless of which direction you go with your Gunslinger, this is a class that's going to be reasonably easy to get into, but once you get into it, you're going to find that you've got a lot of things to manage and consider if you really want to get the most out of it. A large reason that I say this about the Gunslinger really boils down to the gear of the Gunslinger. The Gunslinger, as its name implies, is a very gear-dependent class. Gunslingers specialize either in guns or possibly crossbows, and the book Guns and Gears really goes out of its way to make sure that there are an incredible variety of options under those 2 categories of guns and crossbows. Mix in things like alchemical and magical ammunition, and you get a class that has a sizable array of weapons at their disposal, but managing the particulars of those weapons honestly becomes a little bit stressful. Now, with all that being said, I do want to pause here and offer the usual grain of salt that I throw on my complexity ratings, which is, over many years of running tabletop RPGs, I have learned that player enthusiasm always beats complexity inside of a game. If you are interested in a particular class, I encourage you to give it a shot. I have seen brand new players take some of the most complex characters in TTRPGs and play them successfully because they were excited. The Gunslinger has a lot of fun options and a lot of cool things that you can do with it, and if those options speak to you, by all means give this class a shot. I swear I didn't plan that pun, but it's too good, I'm leaving it in. The good news with the Gunslinger is, getting into the class is fairly straightforward. You're not going to have a lot of decisions when you first start to build the Gunslinger, and the complexity of the class is going to naturally build over time. Since a lot of it is gear dependent, that means that the complexity of this class just kind of adds over the course of many levels, giving you time to adjust and adapt to the complexity of actually playing a Gunslinger. So now let's move on to question number 3, which is, what are the key terms and concepts I need to be familiar with if I want to play a Gunslinger? And on the surface, the Gunslinger is going to seem like a class that's pretty straightforward and easy. Like I said, this is a simple class to get into. One of the cool things that Paizo does with every single class that they publish in this game is they give you a sidebar that highlights the important terms you should be aware of if you choose to play that particular class. This sidebar for the Gunslinger is found on page 107 of Guns and Gears, and it highlights 2 particular terms you want to be aware of. The first term is a term we've seen previously in this series, which is Flourish. Flourish are special actions that a character can perform that require just a little bit extra energy or oomph in order to carry out, and essentially what Flourish means is once per turn. If it has the Flourish trait, you can only do it once per turn, regardless of how many actions it costs, and if you have multiple actions with the Flourish trait, you can only use one of those actions in a turn. Oftentimes the Flourish trait is used to denote particularly dramatic, showy, or powerful abilities that you might be able to deploy at critical moments during combat. The second key term that you should be aware of is the Misfire term. Now, in Pathfinder 1st Edition, Misfire for Gunslinger was a much more serious issue, but they've really toned it down in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. The mechanics of Misfire are relatively simple. If your gun is in danger of misfiring, when you attack with the weapon, you attempt a DC 5 flat check, and if you fail that check, the attack is automatically a critical failure, and you must spend some time cleaning out your gun before you can attempt to fire it again. Pretty straightforward. The real question is, how serious of a risk is misfire? How common should I expect this to be? Well, misfire is not something that's going to show up as a weapon trait, so it's not something that you're going to be seeing constantly with the Gunslinger in 2nd Edition. In fact, the main way that you will risk misfiring your weapon is if you forget to clean it. When you make daily preparations, you clean out and prepare your gun and get it ready for the day, and as long as you remember to do that, you are not at risk for misfiring your weapon throughout that day. However, if you use a gun one day and forget to clean it, then when you pick that weapon up again and attempt to use it, that's when you run the risk of misfiring. So, for the most part, as long as you are keeping your gun clean, misfire is not something you need to worry about. Now, that being said, there are a small number of actions that the Gunslinger can potentially access that can add misfire as a side effect to that particular action, but it's always something that you're always going to know that risk is present. Misfire is never something that should be surprising you if you're playing a Gunslinger. If you're keeping your gun clean, you're not going to misfire, and if it's an ability that has misfire, it's something you know when you take that ability. Now, with all that being said, there is an important point on misfire. If your gun misfires, the attack is treated as a critical failure. There are a lot of abilities in this game that trigger off of a critical failure, so if your gun misfires for any reason, it could be triggering some of those critical failure abilities that you see otherwhere in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, so just be aware of that. Overall, misfire is not a major issue with this class. It's definitely not as serious as it was in the 1st Edition version, but it's still something to be aware of. Now, stepping past the sidebar, if you are a longtime fan of this series, you probably know that I frequently criticize Paizo because it feels like every class comes with lots of extra abilities that you need to know and understand if you really want to play that particular class well? Well, when it comes to class abilities, honestly, the Gunslinger isn't that bad. The main thing that I want to point out here is an ability called Singular Expertise. The Gunslinger has the best weapon progression in the game for two specific weapons, guns and crossbows. Much like the fighter class, the Gunslinger begins play expert in their chosen weapon. They are just naturally better with their weapon than anybody else would be. However, the Gunslinger comes with a bit of a caveat in that they are so focused on guns and crossbows that they can never quite measure up with any other weapon they might try to use. When you first build your Gunslinger, regardless of what character choices you make, if it's not a gun or a crossbow, then you cannot go above trained proficiency with that weapon. You are limited to expert proficiency with guns and crossbows only. As you progress throughout the game, the Gunslinger is going to match the fighter in their incredible proficiency with their chosen weapon, eventually gaining master proficiency and even legendary proficiency. Gunslingers will be landing a lot of crits, but any other weapon that a Gunslinger uses will always be at least one step behind the guns that they have focused on. So if you have master proficiency with guns and crossbows, all other weapons cap out at expert, and when you get to legendary proficiency, all other weapons will cap out at master instead. Now, there is some benefit to the Singular Expertise class feature, and that benefit is +1 damage. Yeah, I know, that's a little bit of a letdown. For all of the limits that Singular Expertise places on what the Gunslinger can do with their weapons, saying +1 damage kind of feels like an afterthought, but the good news here is you do get some bonus damage with your preferred weapons, and since you're probably going to land a lot of critical hits, at the bare minimum, that damage will add up. But honestly, when it comes to the core Gunslinger abilities, understanding Flourish and Misfire and Singular Expertise is going to cover the vast majority of what you need to know, and there are some other abilities to be aware of, but all of that falls under the subclasses or Gunslinger ways that we'll talk about in part 6 of this video. So when it comes to those core concepts that are part of the Gunslinger class, overall it's not that bad. Until we talk about gear. Okay, so the Gunslinger is similar to the fighter in a lot of ways, and one of those is that the Gunslinger is a class that is heavily defined by the gear that they use. The Gunslinger comes with a ton of different mechanical options, but as a result, there's just a lot of little finicky rules and concepts you need to be familiar with so that you know what you're getting into when you pick up one of those guns that your Gunslinger is going to be firing. Really quick, I'd like to run through all of the traits for guns that are found in the book Guns and Gears, but I do want to offer this important note. The guns in Guns and Gears can also have any of the traits you can find from the core rulebook. So all of these traits I'm about to mention, they are not an exhaustive list of what you might need to be familiar with. The next trait worth mentioning is the Concealable trait, which essentially means that the weapon is small and easy to hide, granting you a +2 bonus on any attempt to conceal that object on your person. The next trait worth mentioning is the Concussive trait, and the description of Concussive is a little bit dense in the book. Essentially, Concussive means that the damage is considered both bludgeoning and piercing, and when you are assigning damage from the weapon, you get to choose the better of the two when it comes to determining how the damage of your weapon interacts with resistances or immunities the target might have. If bludgeoning is better for you, treat it as bludgeoning damage. If piercing is better for you, treat it as piercing instead. The next trait worth mentioning is the Double Barrel trait, which essentially means that there are two barrels that can be loaded separately, and you can either fire those barrels independently, or you can fire those barrels at the same time. If you do, you get to increase the damage of your weapon by 1 dice step, and if it has the Fatal trait, you also increase the Fatal die by 1 step as well. However, each barrel must be loaded separately, so it does take additional actions to successfully reload. The next trait worth mentioning is Fatal Aim, and this is a very interesting trait. Essentially, some guns can be used one-handed, but if you take the time to hold them two-handed, they become more effective. However, it is worth noting that if a gun has the Fatal Aim trait, switching between one-handed and two-handed use is more complex than normal, so it will always require an interact action to do so. Another trait you might see is called Kickback, and this is essentially a gun that has extra kick, and as a result deals an extra point of damage, but because the kick is so strong, you need to have enough strength to effectively wield it. Now in Guns and Gears it will tell you that you need a strength ability score of 14 in order to negate any penalties from Kickback. Using the Pathfinder 2e remaster, that means you need a strength attribute modifier of +2. If you have that, there are no penalties when you use a kickback weapon. If you don't have a high enough strength modifier, you will take a -2 penalty on attack rolls because the gun is just so powerful it's hard to aim. The next trait that is mentioned is called Modular, and this is one that we've seen in other places throughout this series. Modular often comes with the labels bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing, or possibly some mixture of those three, and essentially what it means is, as an interact action, you can change the type of damage that the weapon deals. So maybe the weapon normally deals piercing damage, but with an interact action, you could switch it over to slashing damage if the weapon was Modular S. The next trait that is mentioned is the repeating trait, and the repeating trait is applied to guns that are not loaded with individual bullets, but rather are loaded with magazines. This modifies how you load the weapon, but when the weapon is loaded with a magazine, the reload value of the weapon drops to 0, meaning that as long as there are bullets in the magazine, you don't have to interact to reload before you can fire again. Another trait you might encounter is the scatter trait, and honestly the scatter trait you can kind of look at as the splash trait for firearms. Essentially, when you see a weapon with the scatter trait, you will always select a primary target for your attack, and you will deal the weapon's damage when you attack that target, but to any other creature that is in the scatter area around that target, they will take 1 point of damage per weapon damage dice, as some of the shrapnel scatters out and catches them too. Once you've read through all of those traits in the Guns Equipment section of Guns and Gears, you might think you're done, but then you find a later sidebar that adds 3 more traits that you need to be aware of, and these are Combination, Critical Fusion, and Tethered. Combination is a trait that's used to describe weapons that have both a ranged and melee option that are built into a single weapon. You can potentially use this weapon at range or up close and personal, but it does require an interact action to change which version, ranged or melee, of the combination weapon that you're using. The next trait that's mentioned is Critical Fusion, and Critical Fusion is a very niche case trait. It's basically an alternate critical specialization effect for your particular weapon. So if you land a critical hit with the weapon and you have access to critical specializations, you can choose either to use the normal critical specialization or the alternate critical specialization that comes from its Critical Fusion. Finally, we have the Tethered trait, which represents a weapon that is attached to you by a length of rope or wire or in some other similar manner. And essentially, once that weapon is launched, thrown, used, whatever the case may be, you can spend an action to pull the weapon back to you once the attack is over, though it is worth noting that if your opponent has picked up the weapon, you're not going to be able to necessarily yank it out of their grip. As you can see from this quick description, guns come with a lot of traits, and there are a lot of guns that are going to have traits that are available in other books like the core rule books, so you really need to study up on what your gun can do. For example, there are several guns in Pathfinder 2e that come with the parry trait, allowing characters to use the gun to parry incoming attacks. You really need to spend some time analyzing what your gun can do in order to understand how to best use it in play, so don't sleep on the overall complexity of this class. The base class abilities are relatively straightforward, but the particulars of the equipment of this class is really one of those places where you need to pay attention. There is a lot going on. But okay, now that we've talked about the particulars of what you need to know to play the class, let's get into some of the more entertaining conversations and look at question number 4, which is, what are the strengths of the Gunslinger? And the first strength, which should come as no surprise, is Gunslingers are quick on the draw. Gunslingers are one of the best action economy classes in Pathfinder 2e, and you will often be surprised by just how many individual small little things a Gunslinger gets to do during their turn. When you look at things like a Gunslinger's Deeds, which allow them to do a lot of stuff at the start of combat, or the Slinger's Reload, which lets them add actions while they're reloading their gun, Gunslingers just have really, really effective action economy, and you're going to get to do a lot of stuff on your turn. And honestly, this is one of the things that I think is a real design strength of the Gunslinger. The way Paizo portrays the quick draw, the ability to fire a bunch of shots and do a bunch of things in a very narrow window of time, I think it plays into the class fantasy of the Gunslinger very, very well, and it's one of the really fun aspects of this class. Also, another obvious advantage of the Gunslinger is they are a very offense-oriented class. While they can't use the diverse array of weapons that fighters can, they can match the fighter's overall proficiency progression, and the fact that they eventually become legendary in their chosen focus means that Gunslingers are some of the best offensive, attack-oriented characters in this game. The Gunslinger is a class where you're going to get to land a lot of critical hits, and it's going to be a lot of fun. However, I do want to encourage you not to see the Gunslinger as a class that has been pigeonholed into just firing off a bunch of shots and that being the only thing they get to contribute. Paizo has put plenty of space around the Gunslinger where they can do a lot of other things and fill a lot of other roles. And one of the things worth pointing out here is the Gunslinger is not just legendary when it comes to attack rolls. Gunslingers can also become legendary in perception. They don't get it quite as quickly as classes like the Ranger or the Rogue, but Gunslingers can get the best perception proficiency in this game, and that has a lot of potential positive impact on your play experience. First off, as a Gunslinger, you're going to be a very effective scout for your party, and then it's also worth noting that perception is the most common initiative role in this game, meaning that your Gunslinger is quite often going to be going first or near first in combat. It's very in keeping with this class that Gunslingers are very good at spotting their target and often getting the drop on them. Finally, we'll go into this more here in a moment, but I do want to pause and say, the Gunslinger subclasses, also known as Gunslinger Ways, I think they are really, really well done. Generally speaking, I feel like they're really well focused, they're very on point, you know exactly what to expect from the playstyle, and they all play into a very specific fantasy associated with the Gunslinger class. With some classes in Pathfinder 2e, the subclass choices can feel a little shallow or maybe just a little tagged on, but with the Gunslinger, I feel like, for the most part, they've done a very good job of capturing what the subclass is supposed to be and what it means to your character. So I'd just like to say subclass design is on point with the Gunslinger. But what about the flip side of this conversation? What are some of the weaknesses of the Gunslinger class? Well, the first one is going to be fairly predictable in that since this is a martial class that is very offense-oriented, it suffers in the defense department. You have 8 base hit points per level. Your proficiency with your armor is going to scale slower than other classes, even classes like the fighter. And while you technically have access to medium armor as an option, because this is such a dexterity-oriented class, you are most likely going to be stuck with light armor or possibly even explorer's clothes at later levels, meaning that you don't have access to some of the heaviest defensive gear in the game. All of this taken together means that while you are a martial class, while you are very combat-oriented, the Gunslinger is a class that if you get caught, if you get surrounded, you can get overwhelmed very quickly. Adding on top of this, there are several Gunslinger ways that really toy with the idea of being a kind of up-close and personal ranged combatant. In particular, the Way of the Drifter, the Way of the Vanguard, and the Way of the Triggerbrand all want you to be in melee at least some of the time, which is a very risky place for a class that doesn't have quite the defensive edge that other martial classes would normally have. In other words, if you're playing a gunslinger, regardless of which build you're going for, pay attention to where your enemies are and how the battlefield is shaping up, because you don't want to get overwhelmed. You can get taken down pretty quickly. Another weakness worth discussing is the fact that the Gunslinger is a very gear-dependent class. Now, in the third section of this video, I already mentioned Paizo went the distance, offering a variety of options so that gunslingers don't feel like their weapon choices will grow stale. If you're playing a gunslinger, there are going to be a ton of gun options, a healthy variety of crossbow options, and a lot of different alchemical and magical ammunition options. There are a variety of things that you can discover and use and play. Paizo did a good job of giving you plenty of stuff you can choose from. That being said, this is really going to be one of those if your game master lets you kind of things. Looking at the Gunslinger through the lens of the Golarion campaign setting, if you're in and around Alkenstar and Dungenhold, then a lot of the different gun equipment options in Guns and Gears, yeah, you can probably reasonably access them, but in a lot of other places around the setting, it wouldn't be unreasonable for a storyteller to say that your character probably can't find them, or at the very least, that they would struggle to find them. Because gear is so important to the Gunslinger, I really think this is one of those classes where if you want to play a gunslinger, you should sit down with your storyteller before the campaign begins and say, hey, this is what I'm playing, gear is a big part of what my character does, is that okay, and will I be able to find the stuff that I need? And make sure you and your storyteller are on the same page on this subject, because a gunslinger that can't find their gear is a character that's just going to struggle to feel like they can contribute on par with other characters in the group. Now, the final weakness I'm going to mention is not as bad for the Gunslinger as it is for some other classes in Pathfinder 2e, but it's still worth mentioning multiple attribute dependency. As the Gunslinger is a martial or combat-oriented class, it's one of those classes that really hungers for a lot of good attributes in order for it to be effective. Now, the good news for the Gunslinger is dexterity is your core, and as long as you're leaning into your dexterity, you're probably going to be reasonably effective, but you are going to need to consider other things. Constitution is very important for your survivability because, like I've said, you suffer on defense. And while you're primarily a ranged class, if you're using one of the melee-oriented ways, or if you're using a kickback weapon, you're going to need at least some strength in order to make up for those things. And then I've also noted that the Gunslinger leans pretty heavily into perception, which means you probably also want a really good wisdom as well, to say nothing of the attributes that your Gunslinger's way might be pushing you towards trying to build up. What I'm saying is, it's really easy for the Gunslinger to spread itself too thin, trying to do too many things. When you're looking at your Gunslinger character, you want to pay attention first to your dexterity, second to what your way is asking you to do, and third to what you need to do to maintain your survivability. And if you keep those priorities straight, I think you'll be okay here. The Gunslinger is not quite as bad about multiple attribute dependency as some classes can get, but this is a class where it's easy to slip into that mode if you're not paying attention. But now let's move on to question number 6 and discuss the build options or subclasses that are available to the Gunslinger. The Gunslinger subclass options are known as Gunslinger Ways, and as I mentioned earlier, I feel like the Gunslinger Ways are really flavorful, really well done, and really well focused. Every Gunslinger Way is going to offer you 5 specific benefits, 3 of which you get at first level, 1 of which will come online at 9th level, and the last one will become available at 15th level as well. At first level, your way is going to give you access to a particular trained skill, as well as an initial deed and a special action called a Slinger's Reload. Then at 9th level, you'll pick up what's known as an advanced deed, and then finally at 15th level, you'll get the greater deed for your Gunslinger's Way. This isn't a lot of content, it's usually pretty straightforward and fairly easy to grasp, and I feel like it's spaced out well enough that Gunslinger players can pick up on these things pretty easily. Now before we dive into the specific Gunslinger subclass options, I do want to pause and acknowledge the pun master that works somewhere at Paizo. I want you to know I see you. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, at first level, your Gunslinger Way is going to give you a trained skill, a slinger's reload, and an initial deed. And every single initial deed for the Gunslinger takes effect when you roll initiative. Initial deed, roll initiative. I see you, Pun Master, working somewhere at Paizo. I acknowledge your work. Bravo, good job. But as for the actual subclasses, there are presently 6 subclass or Gunslinger Way options that you can choose from. 4 are listed with the Gunslinger class in Guns and Gears. A 5th one is listed in a separate section of Guns and Gears, and then a 6th one was added in Lost Omens: The Impossible Lands. The 4 that are listed with the main class description are the Drifter, the Pistolero, the Sniper, and the Vanguard. Later in Guns and Gears, you can also add the Spellshot Way, and finally, the Triggerbrand is an option that was added in Lost Omens: Impossible Lands. And despite the order that I just mentioned, I'll go ahead and tell you we're going to talk about Spellshot last because it is a little more complicated. But let's take a look at each of these and talk about what they do. Your first subclass option is called the Drifter, and this option focuses on blending ranged and melee combat into a single character. In particular, in this instance, blending the use of a one-handed firearm and one-handed melee weapon that you can use interchangeably in battle. The Drifter focuses very heavily on mobility, allowing you to move around the battlefield, taking shots and making strikes as you go. The Drifter Way will give you training in the acrobatic skill, and your initial deed is called Into the Fray. When you roll initiative, you are allowed to draw both a firearm and one-handed weapon as part of the initiative check, and as long as you can see an enemy and move towards them, you get a free stride that you can use. You just have to end up closer to an enemy that you can see. That's basically 3 actions as part of your initiative roll. Remember when I said this class has crazy action economy? This is an example of that. As for your Slinger's reload ability, this is called Reloading Strike. And basically you make a strike with your melee weapon and reload your firearm at the same time. Your advanced deed for the Drifter is called Finish the Job, and your greater deed is called Drifter's Wake. We're not going to dive deep into what those abilities do, but they continue this theme of blending melee and ranged combat and just moving around the battlefield as kind of a whirlwind of death. It's a pretty exciting combination. The next Gunslinger's Way is called the Pistolero, and this is a way that is focused on using small firearms, and this is a way that is focused on using small one-handed firearms. Now you do have some options that you can build with here. You can have a single one-handed firearm and your character can keep one hand open, or you can play a character that uses 2 one-handed firearms. The point is, the Pistolero prefers weapons that are small, quick, and easy to use. The Pistolero will give you training in either the Deception or Intimidate skill, kind of matching some of those scenes that you see in old Western movies. And their initial deed is called 10 Paces, which gives them an incredible +2 circumstance bonus on initiative checks, and the ability to both draw a weapon and step up to 10 feet at the start of combat, essentially allowing the Pistolero to always make sure that they are out of melee when the fight scene starts. They also get an ability called Raconteur's Reload, which allows them to reload their gun and either create a diversion or demoralize an enemy, depending on what skills they're trained in, at the same time that they're reloading their weapon. At 9th level, the advanced deed for the Pistolero is called Pistolero's Retort, which is kind of a ranged reactive strike. It's a pretty cool option. And then at 15th level, you unlock the greater deed, Grim Swagger, which is essentially an AoE fear effect that uses either Deception or Intimidate to frighten an entire room. If you can't tell, the Pistolero is not just quick in battle, but also is quick-witted and makes an excellent party face. The next Gunslinger Way option is probably the most straightforward. This is the Way of the Sniper, and unsurprisingly, this is the option that's going to focus on stealth and landing huge surprise attacks that people don't see coming. Quite predictably, the Way of the Sniper will give you training in stealth, and then your initial deed is called One Shot, One Kill. This is a little bit more restricted than other ways because you must roll stealth for initiative in order to use this. So exploration mode is one of those things that you need to be paying attention to because how you start the fight matters. But one shot, one kill. If you're rolling stealth for initiative, your first attack is just going to get some bonus damage because no one sees the shot coming. As for your slinger's reload at first level, you get covered reload, where you spend an action to either take cover or attempt to hide, and then reload your firearm. At 9th level, you gain access to your advanced deed, which is called Vital Shot. It's a 2-action activity that allows you to deal bonus damage against an off-guard target. Your weapon will deal an additional damage dice against off-guard targets, and it will also inflict persistent bleed damage against the target. The scaling for the persistent bleed damage is going to follow the damage that you would see from one shot, one kill. Finally, at 15th level, you'll gain access to Ghost Shot, which is a 1-action activity that essentially allows you to add your one shot, one kill damage against a target as long as they are off guard against you. When you look at all of these abilities together, one shot, one kill allows you to have a strong opening attack against your opponents, and then as you progress through the abilities of Way of the Sniper, basically it just offers you some extra ways to keep that bonus damage piling on as long as your enemies can't quite pin down your location. The Vanguard is probably the most complex subclass option that comes with the base class description for the Gunslinger. The Vanguard focuses on what I would personally call a breach style of play for the Gunslinger. It focuses on weapons that have traits like kickback or scatter, so weapons similar to a shotgun, and a lot of the abilities that the Vanguard have focus on kind of getting in and among enemies and shoving them back or attacking groups of enemy and essentially clearing space for your allies to also enter the room and engage with your foes. I will say, if you're looking at the Vanguard, consider your build options carefully, because you're definitely going to want to understand rules for things like repositioning and shoving in order to make the best use of what this particular subclass does. But that being said, I do think it's very unique and engaging, and you can have a lot of fun here. The Way of the Vanguard is going to give you training in the athletic skill, which is going to be helpful for all of the shove attempts you'll be making. And then your initial deed is called Living Fortification, where you draw your gun and raise it up to defend yourself, allowing you to use the parry trait with any gun that you possess, and if it actually has the parry trait, you increase the bonus to your armor class from +1 to +2, meaning that it's a really strong defensive option available to your Vanguard, literally when you roll initiative. As for your Slinger's Reload, you get an ability called Clear a Path, where you make a shove against an adjacent creature and then immediately reload your weapon. This ability is pretty simple and straightforward. You're shoving an enemy, you're kind of moving them around the battlefield and reloading your weapon. That's pretty simple. But one of the sneaky benefits of this is, if you shove an enemy away, you are potentially making it where they can't use abilities like Reactive Strike against you while you're reloading, so Clear a Path can actually be a really nice defensive boon for your character, especially since you are deliberately getting into melee. At 9th level, you'll get an ability called Spinning Crush, where you just kind of spin around and attack everybody around you. It's kind of a funny ability, but could also be pretty brutal in the right circumstances. And then the final ability at 15th level is called Siege Breaker, where you basically leap or stride into an area, make a strike with your weapon that deals some pretty serious bonus damage, and then drop into a really strong defensive position that makes you very difficult to dislodge. Again, all of this taken together really feeds into a very breach style of play, so if you expect to be in a lot of situations where you're going after enemies that have kind of sieged up and sealed themselves in an area, the Vanguard can be really effective about helping your team get in and break those lines. The next subclass option that we're going to discuss is actually the Triggerbrand from Lost Omens Impossible Lands, because this one is a little bit simpler and easier to talk about. This particular Gunslinger way focuses on combination weapons, so firearms that have both a ranged and a melee mode that you can switch back and forth between. Now on the surface, this probably sounds very similar to the Drifter that we mentioned earlier, but allow me to offer you a little bit of distinction, as the Triggerbrand way actually gives you training in the Thievery skill, and this is going to help highlight the difference between the Drifter and the Triggerbrand, Where the Drifter is all about diving in and unleashing a flurry of attacks against your enemies, the Triggerbrand is much more deceptive and cunning, and its style lends more towards blending attacks and trying to steal things from your foes or other opportunistic behavior like that. Your initial deed is called Spring the Trap. It allows you to draw your weapon and then interact to either switch it from ranged to melee or melee to ranged if you need to. And then on your first turn, any movement or ranged attacks that you make don't trigger reactions such as Reactive Strike, as your sudden assault catches your foes off guard. As for your Slinger's Reload, this ability is called Touch and Go. First, you step, then you can interact to switch your weapon from ranged to melee or vice versa, and then finally you are allowed to reload your weapon, essentially allowing for quick maneuvers and changing out options in the heat of battle. Quite possibly the most interesting option for the Triggerbrand is their 9th level advanced deed called Wind Them Up, which allows you to use a melee strike from your combination weapon and mix it in with a steal action against the target, allowing you to both assault a foe and possibly obtain an item that you're after. As for your greater deed at 15th level, this is called Break Them Down, and I don't want to dive into all the mechanics here, but basically you are combining the melee and ranged version of your weapon into a single brutal assault. There's a lot going on here, but it's a pretty fun and effective technique. Now, our last Gunslinger way that we need to discuss, we're going to go back to Guns and Gears. This is a special class archetype that's found in Guns and Gears called the Spellshot, and it's a little bit more complicated than the normal Gunslinger ways. The idea here is that you are blending martial and magical ability together in how you use your firearm to create unique and powerful effects. That being said, I want to make one thing very clear up front. The base version of the Spellshot does not cast spells. I know it says Spellshot in the name, it doesn't get spells, just know that up front. Now the Spellshot is one of those, you could easily mix this in with a spellcasting archetype, and I think you could get a lot of mileage out of it, but just know up front there are no specific spells available. That is an important distinction to be aware of. Another thing you should be aware of if you want to play a Spellshot is it has a few more requirements than other Gunslinger ways. First off, unlike a normal Gunslinger, your class DC is actually going to be built off intelligence rather than dexterity, which can be a little bit of a disadvantage and is going to impact which attributes you really need to focus on to get the most out of this particular class archetype. The other thing to be aware of is if you choose the Spellshot way, you gain access to it at first level, but you are required to take the Spellshot dedication as your second level class feat. The Spellshot dedication is going to give you access to a special ability called Conjure Bullet, which basically lets you pull regular ammunition just straight out of thin air, so this particular version of the Gunslinger doesn't have to worry about finding gear as much. But just be aware that the Spellshot class archetype is going to modify your class DC, and it's going to auto-select your second level class feat. Both of those things are locked in. The cool part about this is Spellshot is a class archetype, so it's also going to add some class feat options to you that allow you to dig into this mixing of magic and martial abilities a little bit further, but those are the basic upfront costs you need to know. As for the Spellshot's trained skill at first level, you will be trained in the Arcana skill, and your initial deed is going to be called Energy Shot, which is going to allow you to draw a weapon as part of rolling initiative, and add a small amount of energy damage that you get to choose to the first 3 strikes that you make during combat. This can be particularly useful for targeting enemy weaknesses, so even if it's not a lot of damage, it's still a nice bonus that you have access to. As for your Slinger's Reload, this is going to be called Thoughtful Reload, and it allows you to combine the Recall Knowledge action with reloading your weapon pretty straightforward. Your 9th level advanced deed is a humorous option called Recall Ammunition, where if you fire your weapon and miss, you can pull the bullet back into your gun so that it's just ready to fire again, meaning that maybe you lost the action but you don't have to reload before you can fire a second time. Your 15th level greater deed is called Dispelling Bullet, which is a 2-action activity that gives you a chance to counteract spells on a target when you hit them with your firearm, and this is actually a pretty good illustration of what I think the Spellshot's intended playstyle is supposed to be. The Spellshot to me is a negation style of Gunslinger. You have a lot of abilities, either directly or through archetype feats, that allow you to negate bonuses that your opponent has access to. Are they behind cover? Well, phase a bullet through that cover and peg them anyways. If you like the idea of playing a Gunslinger who can get around enemy defenses in unique and magical ways, that's what the Spellshot is playing into. So while you may not have spells directly, you still have a lot of fun abilities that you can bring to bear, and this is a pretty unique archetype. And on top of that, since you're using intelligence for your class DC, should you multi-class archetype into a caster that uses intelligence, you could also have some pretty effective spells going as well, but that's also a pretty heavy feat investment choice, so that's a decision you have to make for your character. But now that we've talked about all of that, let's ask our final and most important question: how can I get the most out of the Gunslinger in play? Now, some of the advice here is going to be pretty obvious. You're playing an offense-oriented ranged character, stay at a distance, keep your gun loaded, and find the right opportunity to send some hot lead your enemy's way. Most of that advice is pretty predictable, and anything that falls under the general how to play a ranged combat character well is the kind of stuff that you want to be doing with your Gunslinger. That being said, there are a couple of other things worth discussing, and one of them is, if not your character, at least one character in your group really needs to be good at crafting. I cannot stress this point enough. The Gunslinger is one of the most gear-dependent classes in this entire game, and being able to find, upgrade, and just use the right gear is such a big part of having a good experience with this class. Having a character that is invested into crafting in your party is going to go a long way to making sure that your character is not needlessly hamstrung by their circumstances. Crafting is one of those topics we could chase 1,000 different directions. You've got things like alchemical crafting, magical crafting. There are so many subsections of this conversation, we're not going to dive into them all, but just be aware that having someone on your team who is reasonably invested into crafting is really going to help your character bring the full weight of their skills to bear for the benefit of the party. And a particular nuance worth noting here is, yes, it's completely legitimate for you as the Gunslinger to be the crafter, but there's also a real chance that intelligence is not your strongest stat, unless you're a Spellshot. So if you can travel in the company of an inventor or an alchemist or another class like that, and let them do the heavy lifting on the crafting side of things, then you're going to have the skills to unleash those weapons when it's finally time to bring the hurt to the enemies. Also, the final thing worth discussing when it comes to getting the most out of your Gunslinger is just being very deliberate about how you build out your attributes as a Gunslinger. Dexterity is always the core of what you're doing, and there are very few circumstances where you're going to want to not invest in dexterity if you have the option. But past dexterity, you really need to consider what your role is in the party, what your Gunslinger's way is trying to push you towards doing, and then what you need in order to be effective in combat. If I were to prioritize attributes in general, dexterity is always king for any character that you're playing. Up next is probably going to be wisdom for a lot of Gunslingers, just because of that legendary perception. If you can go first in a fight, you have a lot of advantages. The sniper is an exception here because they want to be rolling stealth for initiative, but for most Gunslingers, a strong wisdom is a really good investment. The next thing worth considering is going to be either Constitution or whatever attribute is appropriate to your Gunslinger way. If you're playing a Pistolero, which uses deception and intimidation, you might want to lead into Charisma for your third stat, but regardless of what your way is trying to get you to do, having Constitution as your third stat is not a bad option because that gives you more hit points, makes you more survivable in a fight. When it comes to Strength, just make sure that you're not falling into the trap of pushing Strength too hard. Yes, there are several versions of the Gunslinger that mix melee and ranged combat, but usually it's to your advantage to focus on melee weapons that still use dexterity and just have a little bit of strength to add in some damage here or there. If you're using a melee weapon or if you're using a kickback weapon, give yourself just enough strength to be effective. Usually that's going to mean an attribute modifier of +2, maybe a little bit more. But don't go too heavily into strength and cause your character to miss out on other attributes that are more core to what they're trying to do. As long as you're paying attention, it's not too hard to balance all of these considerations. As long as you're being focused, I think you'll be fine. As for a final piece of advice for getting the most out of the Gunslinger, I know I've mentioned this at several points, but it's worth repeating here at the end of the video. This is a very gear-dependent class, so a lot of the fun with this class is finding those combinations of special weapons and special ammunition that really make your character feel effective. So dig into Guns and Gears, dig into Treasure Vault, find those cool combinations that just make you feel really effective, and have some fun with those. Seriously, it's core to the class for the reason, so don't skip out on investigating the cool gear that you have access to. And with that, we have covered all 7 questions that are core to understanding what the Gunslinger is and what it has to offer if you want to try one at your gaming table. Which means the time has come for me to turn the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts about the Gunslinger class, and do you agree with my analysis? Are there strengths of the class that I failed to mention or weaknesses that I overlooked? And do you have advice on how a player can get the most out of the Gunslinger class if they happen to give it a shot? Also, as a matter of personal curiosity, Gunslinger is one of those classes that I haven't gotten to try out myself, so I'm really curious if you have a particular firearm or type of ammunition that you think is really fun at the gaming table. If you've got some favorite gear for the Gunslinger, feel free to jump down to the comments section and highlight that as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this class. To give you a quick update for what to expect with this series going forward, starting in January of 2024, I'm going to be doing Classics Remastered, where I'm going to be taking a look at the new versions of the classes from the Pathfinder 2e Remaster, and honestly, with 16 classes getting remastered, I'm probably going to be on Classics Remastered for a while, but that series should be starting in January. If you have any particular questions for Classics Remastered, please let me know either here or in my Discord, and when I start getting to those classes, I will definitely take a look at it. But as always, don't forget to do all that YouTube stuff, like, share, and subscribe, check out my free Discord and my Patreon, do all of that stuff that helps to keep this channel going, and as always, thank you so much for being here, thank you so much for being part of the conversation, have a wonderful day.